Chapter 9. The Master of the Galley. "What d'ye think they had for dinner? Blow, boys, blow. Why, monkeys' tails and bullock's liver. Blow, my bully boys, blow." Halyard Shanty. The light of day had never meant so much to Bert before. As he bounded over the iron sill to the main deck, he gasped, his lungs full of fresh air. Then he ran for the steps to the poop. On the security of the poop, he stopped to breathe and to look back. There was no sign of pursuit. He had expected none. He walked aft, passing the chief mate, who regarded him curiously. At the door of the chart house, where the captain was most likely to be, he paused, and even as he raised his hand to knock, the door opened and an old Chinese shuffled out. Surprised that a Chinese should have an errand to the captain, Bert looked quickly at his face. "Why, Fong Tuck," he gasped. "What are you doing on board?" Then he stepped back in amazement as the yellow man passed without a word or the faintest nod of recognition. Could he have been mistaken? Unobserving people said that Chinese all looked alike, but that was not true. Bert would have sworn that he recognized the Hargraves' house servant, the ex-hatchet man. Perhaps it was merely one of the peculiarities of the race that he chose not to acknowledge his name. As Bert watched him go, he saw that the second mate had just ascended the poop. Then, with a shrug of his shoulders, he turned again to the chart house door, which the Chinese had closed behind him, and knocked. At the captain's "Come in," he entered. There was something about the square set of Captain Hagerstrom's jaw that belied his mild manner and his gentle blue eyes. Again, as Bert looked at the massive head with its thick white hair, he forgot the incongruity of corduroys and flannel shirt on the master of a stately vessel. Unconsciously, Bert found himself thinking that this man did not look like a romanticist who would be carried away by books about the fine old ships of the nearly forgotten clipper ship era. He looked more like a man who would handle his ship capably and meet emergencies squarely, like a man who could handle a mutinous human cargo. Here in the captain's presence, the Negro's warning seemed of less importance, and Bert's first flushed feeling that he was saving the bark and the lives of all the crew faded away. The master of the Queen of Asia listened silently while the boy related his experience and told of the threatened mutiny between decks, leaving out, however, all mention of any personal reason for an attack on his life. Captain Hagestrom nodded his head slowly. "I expected something of the kind," he said. Then he asked a question that took the boy's breath away. "If you were master of this bark, what would you do?" Bert felt as though the club of his unknown assailant had descended on his head again, the master of a vessel asking a common sailor for advice. Or was the skipper taking this method of ridiculing him for what he thought was an absurd yarn? Perhaps the skipper knew that he was the son of A.K. Lindsay, old skinflint, and was merely rubbing it in. Then Bert looked into the captain's calm blue eyes, and his resentment cooled. No petty meanness there, and no weakness. Well, what would he do? "I might lock the hatch doors and keep them prisoners below decks," he suggested. Captain Hagestrom shook his head. "A week of that would kill half of them," he said. "And after all, they're human beings." "Then I would post armed guards at the entrance to the 'tween-decks quarters and at strategic places along the decks, including one on the poop deck and one on the forecastle head where they could command the main deck." The skipper looked at the young seaman with a peculiar gleam in his eyes. "And how would you arm the guards?" he asked quietly. Why, aren't there any guns on board?" he gaped. "Yes," the captain nodded. "I have a .45 automatic of my own, and the mate has another, but we could hardly turn those over to guards. The bark has no arsenal. I have asked for guns, but the company's policy of rigid economy has overruled my requests." Bert was dazed by the information. A few guns in the hands of the crew would have equalized the 5-to-1 odds. Without the guns, it was still 5-to-1. Man for man, the husky fishermen who made up the crew were better than the diseased, undernourished, drug-ridden members of the China gang, but not 5 times better. It was only in the movies that one man whipped a dozen or half a dozen, or even 3 determined and unscrupulous assailants. So since we have no guns, Captain Hagestrom went on, we shall have to play the unsatisfactory game of watchful waiting. Try to keep informed of their plans through the Negro who helped you out, but don't go below decks again without orders. Incidentally, you had no business down there in the first place. Say nothing about this to any of the crew, and report to me as often as you get information. Bert backed towards the door. Yes, sir, he said, surprised at how humbled he felt before this roughly dressed skipper, whom his father employed. He began to understand that he was developing a very profound respect for the people he had referred to as the men who do the work. One more thing, the skipper said. I may as well tell you that the Chinks will be on our side. Just before you came in, an old cutthroat informed me that if trouble came, the Chinamen would be good boys. He evidently expects trouble. Outside, Bert unconsciously directed his steps toward the galley. So the Chinese would be good boys. Did that mean they would passively fail to join the mutiny, or that they would fight beside the crew to quell it? 50 aged Chinese, Bert thought, would neither be very formidable antagonists nor very powerful allies. Still, 50 subtracted from the 250 of the China gang and added to the 50 of the crew would reduce the odds from 5-1 to 2-1. As he passed the open deck aft of the midship deckhouse, the space sacred to the seamen's promenades, he noticed a dozen men pacing restlessly up and down. 3 days at sea, with fair weather and consequent inactivity, already the men were beginning to chafe for their lack of exercise. Strong bodies trained to hard work did not take naturally to this life of leisure. That surplus energy would have to find an outlet somewhere, Bert surmised. All but 2 or 3 of the men were sober now, but they had plenty more moonshine, as Bert knew from their conversations. Soon this restlessness would lead to fights, or to more drinking, or both. That time-honored rule of the sea that kept every man at work during every minute of his watch on deck, leaving him just enough time to eat and sleep, was not due entirely to the meanness of bucko mates and slave-driving skippers, the boys suspected. A busy man had no time to get into trouble. Times had changed, though. In the old days, no matter what shape a clipper ship was in when she put to sea, she came back trim as a yacht. Nowadays, these salmon packets, the last survivors of the once vast American sailing fleet, were scarcely touched from the time they left their winter berth in the Oakland estuary until they laid up again in the fall. The Fishermen's Union had something to do with that. No conditioning of vessels at sea. Give the shipwrights and riggers something to do during the winter. But Bert wound his way along the deck, unheeding the innumerable Mexicans and Negroes who lounged everywhere, and paused at the open galley door, stopped by the high-pitched voice of the cook. Inside, the tall chief mate stood grinning cheerfully, while the cook pounded the iron deck with his peg leg and brandished a cleaver dangerously close to the mate's nose. "Guard!" he screamed. "You won't give me no guard. Joe Bloom runs this galley and guards it too. Just let one of that lousy gang set foot inside this galley and I'll open his skull with this cleaver." "All right, Joe, all right," the mate soothed. "You don't have to have a guard. Only the captain saw a bunch of them hanging around the door and thought they might try a raid. Said to ask you if you wanted a sailor on duty to keep him out." "So," the cook's voice went up another note, "the captain, is it? You tell the captain Joe Bloom says for him to stay on the poop and mind his own business. Do I go aft and offer to help him lay a course? I do not. I stay where I belong and run my galley. If the skipper don't know his place, I'll show him, by God. He'd give me a guard, would he? For 39 years, man and boy, I've gone to sea, and no captain—" The mate backed discreetly out the door, giving Bert a broad wink as he passed. Bert stepped into the mess and made himself a huge cheese sandwich from the always present supply of food on the sailor's lunch counter. Then, taking a thick cup from the rack above the counter, he advanced cautiously to the galley door, prepared to retreat hastily if necessary. "Could I get a cup of coffee?" he ventured. The cook shot a quick glance at him, then pointed to the 2-gallon coffee pot on the stove. Yes, yes, help yourself, my boy. That's what it's for, he said in an astonishingly mild and gentle voice. He stood watching silently while Bert poured his cup full. Then he opened an oven and drew out a steaming pie. Wait a minute, and I'll cut you a piece of pie. The mincemeat's made out of carrots and turnips. Cheap canned stuff. But as an old hand at the game, I'd say the crust was pretty good. Bert accepted the pie gratefully and stayed in the galley talking with the cook while he munched his sandwich and pie, not forgetting to praise the pie crust. He noticed a bloody rag tied around the cook's left thumb. Why don't you have Doc bandage up your thumb? He asked, remembering at the same time his own mental reservations regarding the doctor's cleanliness. And the cook's voice shot up the scale till it was almost a scream. Merely the usual sign, Bert decided, that he was excited. Him? He cried. That unwashed blackguard? That dirty crook? I wouldn't let him pull a sliver out of my wooden leg if I was dying of it. Bert smiled in spite of himself. What's the matter with him? Matter? What's the matter with a snowbird who served 2 terms in the pen for peddling dope and who had to write his own medical certificate? Ask me something hard. Hastily engraving the cook's statements in his memory, Bert pressed him for more information. But why does the company hire such a man? Boy, said the cook, his voice coming down to something like its natural tone. Money talks. 2 ways. First way, the wages is so low that no sawbones who's worth his salt will take the job, else he's a young buck just out of medical school. Second way, the doc on a cannery ship can make good money on the side, if he's built that way. Now clear out. I've got to start supper.